I thought I was done with the blueprint series, and then as I was going to put some away, I stumbled across a few things that I wanted to share. So these blueprints are of the first sanctuary, so what we now call Crafts Hall. So the first building that was built of Christ Church, and what was part of that building, particularly the chancel area of the sanctuary. So it included covering over the back window that currently is in that chancel area, a dossal, which this is a fabric hanging that hung behind the altar that usually was the color of a liturgical season, but sometimes it didn't change. That was part of that original design. As interestingly, the pulpit and lectern are on opposite sides of the current sanctuary, which is a little different. This altar is what is up in the upper room chapel. So this altar has been retained. There's a close-up of this on a different page, which I'll turn to, and the use of hymn boards. So before copying became something that we could do efficiently and inexpensively, these boards, which had numbers, so let's say the 3 hymns would be on here, maybe the call to worship being used as a psalm, that would be a number here. The Lord's Prayer might be a number here. So this was your guide to the service, and you used the hymn book as your service book, your worship book. So when you came into worship, this would guide you through the experience of worship, because there wasn't a bulletin necessarily with that information to be presented. Few other details are some of the rails that are used, the design of the actual pulpit and lectern. That's an overhead of the chancel area, so the choir sat behind the lectern in the original, and more of the choir and the organ console there with what they call a high altar. A high altar simply means it's pushed against the back wall, and then here at the bottom of the stairs surrounding it was a communion rail. And that is what we see here, is the communion rail. So here represents a close-up of the Chi Rho that was central to the altar, as well as how that communion rail would have employed these things, which got transferred or used in the current sanctuary. We have these slides to contain the communion cups, which was the common practice of that time, and now we're kind of using a different kind of cup, so it's interesting how things come full circle. So again, this represents the same thing with this dossal, this hanging. You see then the hymn board and where it would have been, pulpit and lectern. What's interesting here is the table doesn't appear quite the same as it is in other places with the Chi Rho as we had. Specific designs of the spindles for the communion rails. But interesting stuff to see which aspects of this were retained as the current sanctuary was built. So pulpit and lectern in some ways look pretty similar. And this design, the simplicity of this design in some ways ends up being what I think kind of was constructed for the current sanctuary in a larger form with the cross, and ended up being a hanging cross and no dossal at all. So there you have, and if you didn't know the term dossal before, and now you know it, it's a wall hanging that hangs behind the altar of a church. So another part of our blueprint series of the history of Christ Church.